I love how you crafted it, this idea of a lifelong pursuit of something that you're passionate about. I was thinking about how if you find something, and I don't know if the word obsession is the best word to describe it, but you find something that you think about falling asleep and you think about going to bed. And that's something that I experience when I think of broadly defined investing. Investing framed in a certain way as, on one hand, ownership of businesses. On the other hand, it serves a certain purpose, which is to grow and in a way perpetuate family fortunes that have truly infinite investment horizon. The second thing that I'm exploring and I find fascinating is I don't do it for the money. And when I picked up One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch, 20-some years ago, 25 years ago by now, I saw this book not as a message that here I'm going to beat the market and I'm going to become the richest person in the world. No, I thought of it as this is a fascinating intellectual pursuit for me. So, but if you find something that you would do, even if the money was not part of the equation, that's something really special. With the investment profession, you could actually become your own client. At some point, and I love the fact that it's so aligned that if the idea is good for me, an investment idea is good for the clients, and it's in an ideal world good for all the clients, right? There's this beautiful alignment that I don't have to be selling something to somebody that I wouldn't buy. No, if this is a good idea for me, it's good for the client. If it's good for the client, of course it's good for me. I love that it's so straightforward. But what I'm saying here is that if you're successful at what you do, however you define it, you become your own client with your own money. Eventually, you don't really have to do it for the money. And when you really think about it, that's the beauty of it. And the last thing I'm going to say is that you care. And it's very important to me, and I mention it quite a lot, that it's as simple but as profound to me that you actually care. If you find somebody that's obsessed, is not doing it for the money, and they actually care, I mean, you should treasure individuals like these, whether they're your accountants or your doctors or your dentists or your lawyers or your investment advisors. The more people like that you can have in your life, I think the luckier you are. Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. I have Jeff Gilbert today on the show, and Jeff was a guest a few months ago. How are you, Jeff?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited for this conversation. We haven't even started recording, and we're already swapping stories, so I can only imagine where this will go today. But for the benefit of the audience, this is a different episode. It's a Fireside Chat where Jeff will be asking questions. And I started this new tradition with Matt Ziegler, who is a good friend. And I had Matthew Stafford, Christian Billinger, John Rotanti, and our mutual friend Jeremy Deal on the show that took your spot, asked me questions. And I absolutely loved it because each of them took the conversation in a different direction. So I'm thrilled, excited, a little bit nervous where Jeff will take this conversation. So Jeff, it's all yours.
Thank you kindly. I'm looking forward to the chat as well. At Value X, one of the first things Guy does is he shines the light on somebody else. So the first time that I finished my little pitch or whatever, he said, let's talk about our mutual friend and shine the light on somebody else. Who do you think? Is there a person, a book, a restaurant, a podcast? Who do you think deserves the light shined upon? That you want to use this platform now to say, this person should get more attention?
So there are so many people, and I feel like this podcast has been a chance for me to do that, to shine light on people that I admire, that I respect, and in many cases, people that have not given too many interviews, but I feel like people should hear what they have to say. And you make it very hard on me because you say one person, and I brought 100 people on this show already that I wanted to talk to. And there are a couple more people that I'd love to have on the show. But if I had to pick one person, it's somebody that became a mentor to me, somebody that I look up to, and somebody that I talk to quite often. And it's Tony Deedon. Tony Deedon is a Swiss-based investor. He lived in the US for many years, and he invests money for families with a very long-term perspective. And he owns family-owned businesses to make it more interesting and build this very long-term way of looking at how you treat a business. And I'm sure we'll talk more about it. And I manage money for families, and I've learned a lot watching Tony and other people in the business. But I feel like Tony, he gave a wonderful interview with Grant Williams years ago that many people know. I think it has 1 million or 2 million downloads, views on YouTube. I highly recommend it. And I would love to have Tony on this show, and he knows. So Tony has an open invitation to join me because we've had so many wonderful conversations, and I told him that I'll make the questions a little bit easier if we're recording. And I'm very much looking forward to shining more light on Tony and the ideas that he has, because I feel like a lot of us could really benefit from this kind of way of looking both at the capital that you invest and the kind of businesses you'd like to own. And I think Tony's lessons and principles and philosophies should be engraved somewhere and handed to all the 20-year-olds starting out in business, whether you will go into investing or any other aspect of it. But I feel like Tony would be the person I'd love to have on the show and shine even more light on.
Great answer. Thank you. We all have mentors. You mentioned one mentor already, Tony. One of the life-changing mentors in my life was Charlie. And Charlie spoke about he wanted to be brutally honest in life and in his affairs. And he mentioned that he deserved no reward for being so honest and, I'll call it, ethical in his dealings. He was just being long-term greedy. Now, it's an interesting insight from him, right?
Yes.
In other words, he's not choosing ethics because it's the right thing to do. He's choosing ethics because over the long term, people will want to sell their business to him. People want to be doing business with him. In other words, his phone would be ringing. You've studied a lot of companies for a long time. Can you think of companies that chose the ethical route, the long-term route, rather than a short-term route? And you could go back in time, make this from the 80s, 90s, whenever you like, or even older. But I just think it's a fascinating lens. Long-term thinking, ethical thinking, using those principles as one of the checklists for long-term financial performance will come from that behavior.
I think it's a fascinating question and a bigger framework that comes to mind when I'm listening to you. And I feel like when you think of a business as something that an entity, a creation of sorts that provides a service or good. And there are two ways to go about it, just to make it very extreme. You interact with somebody only once and you never see them again, or you'd like to have them as a loyal customer. And I think that's where the difference happens. When you can build, and when you analyze businesses, you start to see that the ones that succeeded were able, especially over a long period of time, to create a certain level of loyalty. And there are many ways to go about it. And if you can create that kind of bond, and I'll use a brand that everybody knows that I've followed for many years, and this conversation is no recommendation of any kind. We're just talking about a case study, but I'll talk about Apple and an iPhone. And I see this fascinating phenomenon, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the installed base of iPhones in the world, it's in billions from what I know. And there are hundreds of millions sold units every year. So when you think about the billions that have an iPhone in their pocket, they're coming back to get another iPhone. And this company, in some way, was able to create an emotional bond between a device, a cold piece of metal and glass with software. And our emotions are hard. We're invested in this. And it's fascinating. It's one of many companies that were able to create it, but that's something really special. But you build the trust, you build something that people can connect with, and you go back and you know what you're going to get, and you're not even thinking about alternatives. So it's not transactional, as in you sold that many units and these people are not coming back. You're thinking, what can I do? And it completely reframes the conversation when you're running any business. What can I do to have these people, customers, stay with me or come back to me? And that's a completely different conversation. To me, I'm thinking of a gas station with a restaurant on a highway. And many people will pass that gas station and even stop at that restaurant. But the truth is that many people will not go back to the same restaurant again unless they're traveling through the same part of the country next year, right? I'm talking about the other extreme. And if you're serving food that's not so good, you will still get pretty good volume because you get always new people and always new people and always new people until the word gets around and everybody knows this is a terrible gas station. You shouldn't stop there, right? But you have this each individual purchase done and you build no loyalty unless you're a truck driver and you stop there every single time. But most of the people will stop by once. So you always wonder, what's the incentive for this restaurant to serve good food? And that's the other end of the extreme, instead of having a very loyal, repeat kind of customer base. But I think these days we see this phenomenon where with ratings, reviews, and social media, that even an experience like this gets shared around. So if I had a bad experience with this restaurant, I will share it with not just 5 friends, but I'll share it with different websites and different rating review sites. And the next customer will not come back. I think the point I'm trying to make is that the business will learn very quickly that if you treat the customer poorly, it will catch up with you. And on the other end of the spectrum, with an iPhone, if you treat the customer very well and they feel like they're getting so much more value, you will have a bond for life, right? So 2 ends of the extreme. Where would you like to be as a business owner? Or where would you like to put your money as an investor? Which kind of business? And I think it's fascinating to watch how the customer is treated. And we're just talking about one layer, right? You can have the suppliers and employees. But a company that treats the customer well usually starts to treat the suppliers well, and then all the stakeholders as well. I think going back to Charlie, the lesson is that if you treat everybody that participates with you in that business well, the dividends will come and you build something that can last and can be tested by time.
That's a remarkable answer. You brought up a number of things in my head. My wife needed a new cell phone. We walk into the cell phone store. Right. The starting point is show me the Apple phones. Everything else is automatically out. And like, this isn't me talking. This is my wife. Like, she has the watch, she has the phone, she has the Mac Air, whatever Pro. And so she needs something within that network that communicates with it all, and it's seamless. And so they sell the iPhone 15 or 16 or whatever it was. And then you connect the 2 phones, holding it together. And a couple minutes later, everything is exactly set up the way she wants it. That is the definition of what I would call sticky.
Mm.
Good luck to competitors of that type of ecosystem, network effects. Another thing that came to mind as you were talking, and I think it's the Dondo Investor, but I'm struggling, where he describes two gas stations, one like right beside each other. Is that Monish's book?
I think it's in that book, yes.
Yeah.
Monish Pabrai.
Yeah. So I think I'm getting this right. And you have one gas station, another gas station. It's a commodity. They're both selling gas.
Uh-huh.
One, they're running out to clean the windows,
Mm-hmm.
customer service with a smile.
Mm-hmm.
The other, they're just selling the gas.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, which one produces the dividends?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a replica of what you were
Mm-hmm.
saying, with those gas station, customer service, etc. The other thing that comes to mind is, and I'm sure you studied them as well, like Nick Sleep's, if you are Costco and you never rip off a customer, and you do this consistently, and no matter what, even when you have the opportunity to rip them off, you choose not to, it builds trust and loyalty.
That's an even bigger point that you're raising that I love. And I talked about it with Christian Billinger on the show, doing the right thing. And doing the right thing, even if nobody can see that you're doing the right thing. Like you're going so far with the service that you provide. And I think it's very important in the investment profession as well, where you come across somebody that you know that you might not be able to tell if they're doing the right thing, but you know that on some level they will always do the right thing, even if it's at the expense of their immediate gain and profit and so on. And it's fascinating. It's intangible, and it builds trust. It's somebody that you know will take care of you. And I grew up in a household with two doctors, two physicians, and I saw them go out of their way to do things that they were never paid for. My dad would pull over in a car when there was an accident. He would walk over and help people. He would never bill for it. And it was something he had to do. And I feel like when I think of the work that I do, working with families, there's so many moments where there's definitely value provided and work being done. And I'm doing the right thing, but nobody knows about it. But I don't see any other way of going about it. The same way my dad couldn't see any other way of going about it. You have to pull over and help people. And I think that's something that it's intangible. It's not on the balance sheet. You can't see it, but I think it builds incredible businesses. It builds incredible practices. And people notice that. And building on that, I want to bring up how whenever, and you've been to Omaha a couple of times, we saw each other there this year, I meet people that have owned Berkshire shares. And again, it's no endorsement of Berkshire. Everybody has to do their own research, but have owned shares for decades. And I talk to them, and I'm very curious about the initial decision to participate and buy. And the best way I can describe it is a certain level of trust, intuition, gut feeling that Buffett would be the guy to do the right thing for them. They can't analyze it. They don't have the ratios. They don't have the metrics. They don't have the technical understanding of how Buffett is analyzing businesses and building a portfolio. And they don't have it. The same way I go to a doctor, I don't know how the knee surgery should be done, but I know that doctor is competent, cares, and will do the right thing even when I'm not actually conscious during the surgery, right? So they have that revelation about Buffett, and I'm fascinated because I meet people like that at Markel's meeting as well, people that have had Markel shares, also not a recommendation, do your own research, but that have owned those shares for decades. And I asked them, and I realized when we think of an investment decision, you had all the facts, you had all the ratios, you read the filings, but on some level, they just trusted the people who are running the business. The environment will change, the interest rates will change, the presidents will come and go, but that leadership and the culture of that company will provide what they're looking for. And I don't have the best way to describe it, but I think on some level, we all understand it in so many other areas of our life. And I think in investing, if you come across somebody that you can just really, really trust, it's there, and we know it's there, even if we can't explain it or show the ratios and the metrics that prove that Buffett would have been a success in like 1985 to the extent that he has become. Nobody actually knew when you really think about it. And I got to talk to people that knew Buffett back in the 80s. I had them on the show as well. And I realized that even Buffett didn't know he will be such a success, but he knew what the principles are and what the philosophy is, and Munger too, that will directionally set them on the right course. That was enough.
When I sit and listen to those gurus speak, can't help but reflect, man, do I trust these people.
Mm-hmm.
I've bought Burke on downturns more than once. And the sleep at night factor is there in droves, right? Management integrity is not really an issue. And just one small micro story. I was walking with the investment guru, and we're seeing Clayton Homes and Geico, but there's also like kind of companies that are just doing okay. They're not really contributing cash flow. They're completely immaterial at this point. Mm-hmm. They're still at the booth, right? They still have their own. Warren treats them like they're members of the family. And so he doesn't ignore or put the smaller ones, boot them out.
Right.
They're still there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a small microcosm of trust. I'm going to jump to a question what you were reminding me of in a big way. So the question goes, if I say something, let's Google something, it's become a verb.
Right.
If I say, it's been Uberized or Uberization of the service,
right.
Everybody knows what this means. It's a verb. Simon Sinek, who's probably somewhere behind me, wrote, it's the same for values. For values or guiding principles to be truly effective, they have to be verbs. It is not integrity. It's do the right thing. And of course, when I read that, first of all, it reminded me of the way Charlie talked. Second of all, things are said as simple as possible, and he's brilliant at doing that. Mm-hmm. So I've heard more than one investment pitch that it's like, this company is now becoming a verb. And so it's a mental model in a way. That in combination with simplification. So articulating our values as verbs is one way of going through life. Thoughts, comments on that?
Mm-hmm. I would put it this way. As I'm listening to you, I was thinking of a recent conversation I had with Chris Beck. Chris Beck teaches the original security analysis course at Columbia that Ben Graham used to teach. And we were talking about purpose, mission statements of businesses. And he had an interesting observation, and it rhymes with what you're saying. He said that companies that ask a question, how can we do this? Instead of saying, this is the only way to do it, are on very different paths. And I feel like when I think of my professional aspiration, I'm thinking of how can we make sure that the families that I work with that might have multi-generational wealth can benefit from what this financial capital can offer for many generations to come. So I'm asking a question, and I'm trying to continue to find the answers, and the answers will evolve and change, right? So it'll be a different collection of businesses. It might be slightly different approaches. Even value investing has evolved. But I like the idea of framing things as, you said, the verb, but also as a question. How do we do it? How do we make a customer happy? That's a question, right? And you kind of look for the answers. If you give the absolute answer, you limit yourself in a way. And some companies make us believe that they have the ultimate answer. And I always feel uncomfortable with that thought, because it might be Kodak had the answer what photography should be for a long time. A camera with a film, and they were making money selling the film and developing it. But I'm thinking of Kodak that proposed one way of thinking about recording memories, right? And we both know that has changed. I wonder if they reframed the question around how can we preserve memories, they would have evolved. I wonder. I don't know. It's just a playful question that I could ask. But if they had a different way of looking at things, and I think in investing, we both learned about Ben Graham that was investing in a completely different way than we're investing today. He lived through the Great Depression. He was holding probably 100 stocks or so that were mathematically cheap, and he had no intention of holding them for the long run, and he was actually not that interested in what these businesses do. I'm hoping it's not a shock to this audience, but that's what was happening, and that's how he was successful. And then Buffett took that formula and build on it. You brought up Charlie Munger, but Charlie allowed him to build on that formula. And these days, I think we continue to build on that formula. So the question of how to invest money in a certain way that allows us to compound wealth over time without taking risks that in my mind are not acceptable, the answer to that question will evolve. And I think the way we invest will evolve. I got to work with different investors that remembered their mentors, remembered the Great Depression. So they remembered the stories were passed on. And I noticed that there are two kinds of investors, at least. The ones that are trying to do the same thing repeatedly over their lifetime, and they still try to find low PE stocks or companies with physical assets, tangible assets in an economy that's asset light or asset free. So the formula continues to evolve and change. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that if you pose it as a question instead of as an ultimate answer, that value investing, for example, is just this, instead of reframing the answer as you go, I think it can provide more options and you can be more adaptable than having one ultimate answer.
I love doing root cause analysis. So I don't only read business success, I like to read business failures. To me, it's just fascinating.
Yeah.
Kodak had a research and development division. They had digital cameras. So the question becomes very obvious. Why, with their digital cameras and the market starting to move towards digital technology, computer on every table, desk, etc., why is it that they didn't pivot?
I've actually heard different versions of the story, and we can talk more about it, but I think what was happening at the time was they saw immense profits in one way of doing things. And I think it's sometimes the biggest success of the business, it's its biggest obstacle. And I know of very few stories of size where a company could actually successfully pivot. People might not remember, but the Netflix that existed 20 years ago, that was shipping DVDs in red envelopes to your home, competing with Blockbuster. Many of the audience might not remember Blockbuster, some of you might. Is a different business that exists today. Again, no recommendation of Netflix, obviously. But today it's a streaming service. You pay every month and you have access to a growing library, which actually differs by country, which is interesting. And I think Netflix did a lot of different things, including producing its own content, which it wasn't doing back in the day. So Netflix, to me, it's a company that completely changed the way they do business and took a massive risk to reinvent itself. But most businesses like Kodak, from the stories I've studied over the years, investing in businesses, if they're stuck on doing one way of doing things, it's very, very hard to pivot and give up the original profit pool and incredible margins in one business and say, we're going to do it in a different way. And I think you're touching on something interesting, because when we talk about investing and innovation, I always ask the original question, why are we even doing it? And to me, investing is ownership of businesses. Why would you own a business? Because a business can potentially generate profits. Now, throughout history, I see those profit pools created in certain segments of the market. And then in other places, that profit pool gets drained because of innovation. Amazon disrupted a lot of businesses, a lot of stores, a lot of retail, and the entire verticals in retail disappeared because they moved online. But then I wonder, these were profit pools for different, participants, and those profit pools went away. And I always wonder with innovation, just because we're disrupting an industry, does it mean we're creating a bigger, better profit pool? And I don't know if somebody has done the math, but if you took all of retail profits in 1955, let's say, and took all of profits of what you would call retail today, and adjusted for inflation. Is this a bigger pool? I don't know, but I'm curious. But that's something that investors have to think about, because we're continuously looking for profit pools. We're not just looking for innovation and new ways of doing things. We're wondering if this new way of doing things will create profits. And sometimes the new ways of doing things will improve the experience for the customer, or even maybe disrupt some monopoly position for the suppliers so they can actually get a better deal. But at the end of the day, the actual profit in that industry, is it bigger or is it smaller than it was before? And you brought up Uber, no recommendation of any kind. But as a customer, I'm obviously a fan of Uber. I think it saved me on so many occasions where I didn't have a ride to get somewhere, not only in the US, but even traveling internationally. But has Uber drained a certain profit pool from an industry that back in the day was very rigid? I'm thinking of New York City specifically, where it's not that easy to get a medallion. It's called a medallion to be able to drive around in the city. Open-ended question. I don't have the answer, but I always wonder what the innovation, even today AI, is it going to drain profit pools or create new profit pools? And you, Jeff, might have a better answer than I do.
I have thoughts, not necessarily a full answer. I try to think probabilistically and rationally. Odds are you're going to overwhelmingly have some technological innovation and change. Odds are it's going to result in an oligopoly with 2 or 3 dominant players. But what exactly is going to be innovated and changed? I have a history of being very wrong in my predictions. So I've learned over time to be very careful with it. However, what I have learned is there's some principles and ways of thinking that are useful. So Kodak had an entire division and process for those chemicals, for it going to various divisions. And changing the entire company is very, very challenging when your vice presidents are vice presidents of those divisions that you've worked with for a long time. Mm-hmm. And because you brought it up, Amazon, when I was reading about how Bezos set it up, as an example, every time the phone rang, that meant that there's something that they should have done simpler. Mm-hmm. Every single phone ring is an error. There should never be a phone ring. Right? We could solve the problem with one click. We could solve the problem with the returns. And so the way they set up the user interface was to simplify absolutely everything. And another brilliant thing that they did was they said, your default answer is not no. Your default answer is yes. Now, if you want to say no to a new idea within the company, that's fine. You have to justify your no. So they changed the entire structure, and that was cloud computing, by the way. Cloud computing, I don't think that was an original intention of the business, but now a massive portion of cash flow comes from it. And that idea came from an employee, and they had to justify a no, and they weren't able to justify a no. And so the processes and systems within the company matter greatly when analyzing it, and it's not necessarily going to be reflected in a statement of cash flow.
You bring up something fascinating, and I think the best way I can frame it as I'm listening to you is when we're interacting with businesses, it's kind of a two-way street. So I'm booking a flight, and it's set up these days that I don't have to talk to anybody. I can choose the flight, I can choose the seat, I can even choose if I'm going to have a checked bag. Done deal. If I'm really good with the app, I can be done within a minute and I have my flight. Now something goes wrong, and I have to change the flight, or I have to change the seat. And the airlines have gotten much better at it, but not long ago, I would say 2-3 years ago still, I was observing it, that they made you call them to make certain changes. You couldn't do it through the app. And I see it as, I think I have this image of a funnel, right? Like, so all of us booking a flight for the 300-seat flight or 200-seat flight, and then 5 of us trying to reach back the airline and change the flight. And I think that's the yes and no and the phone ringing that you're talking about. They improved so much because during COVID, we had so many rebookings and flight changes that they found a way so that I can do even more myself without calling anybody. But there are situations where you have to get somebody on the phone with a bank, with an airline, even with a subscription of some sort. And the system is so fascinating because on one hand, it has 1 million customers. On the other hand, it doesn't have the capacity to take a call from 1 million customers. And I don't have the answer, but I find it fascinating as just analyzing businesses and the scale of things these days, right? Like when we think about Netflix, everybody tunes in, and it's millions of us watching the same show. And this just works. And we just assume it has to work, but it's a bit of a miracle when you think about it. And if it didn't work, I was watching a TV show and somebody had a problem with a cable subscription. It was an older movie from 20 years ago, and they were on the phone in the evening. They couldn't watch the movie, and they're spending 2 hours trying to figure out why the box doesn't work. And I was imagining for a second the investor hat that I wear. If this was Netflix, and all of us had to call Netflix and ask, why doesn't this video play? Netflix doesn't have the capacity to take our calls, right? So Bezos was thinking about the phone ringing. Netflix doesn't even have the ability to answer that phone. Too many of us would be calling, so it just has to work. I'm fascinated with the scale of things these days and how we can touch so many people and so many lives at the same time. And then the system just has to work like a Swiss watch. But if it doesn't, the undoing or making the call can be tricky.
You're reminding me of another thought process that I spent some time looking at. Which companies are so unbelievably good that I'm willing to pay to shop there?
There is one or two, yes.
Which companies are so unbelievably good because they have unbelievable reward systems?
Mm-hmm.
And once again, I'll put all the caveats, not investment advice, but I watch people interact with Starbucks. It's very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
The Starbucks reward system, the prepaid cards, in fact, the entire prepaid card system and reward systems are fascinating and have some stickiness to them as well, and have weird psychological effects that I think would create loyalty. Do you have, is that on a checklist for you? Is that like part of, like, is that something that you would actually look at? Float, cash flow, cash in advance is one thing, but as well as reward systems. And if you have a strong reward system, that could create, if it's done right, it's a very effective marketing tool.
I love that question. I wrote down 2 words, value, as in value proposition, and kind of future-proofing your investment. And let me answer the two, the way I see the problem. One is, I don't know the future. I can't make any predictions, right? And I know that. And anybody that claims they know the future, I have some doubts about it. But what I can try to find out when I'm buying a business is, I see a certain success that we've been talking about of any nature. And I'm curious how repeatable it is. Mm-hmm. And the loyalty part, the rewards part, that's one of the insights that allows us to see that this business has pretty good odds of having people show up the next day or the next week and the next week, or for the next phone upgrade, or for the next subscription renewal, again and again and again. And it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because they see value. Like when you think about a business, and I think we get a bit confused because there are tickers, there's a daily price, and there's just so much noise. But if you get to the bottom of it, a business exists and continues to exist because it provides value. And somehow you go to a store and you feel like, yes, I spent $100, but I kind of have a feeling that I walked out with $150 of value. And you can't put a number on it. It could be convenience, right? Like when I say value, it doesn't mean like dollar for dollar. It could be, it was an easier drive, or I stocked up the entire car with the goods that I wanted, and they had everything I wanted, and they smiled, and I had a coffee, and I felt good about shopping there, right? So it's a lot of intangible things. You walk out of the store. And I mean, you know, the store you go to every week, or a luxury goods store where they make you feel wonderful and they give you a glass of champagne, right? So it's a whole range of experiences, but you feel like I received more than I paid, which is the essence of investing. When Munger said all investing is value investing, you're trying to get more than you paid, right? Like that's the essence of what we're trying to do. And as customers, we try to do this. As investors, we try to do this. As employees, we do the same thing. We provide a lot of value to our employer, and we hope we get compensated for it, right? Like if anybody that feels shortchanged at any point of this experience on any end, you stop at that gas station we talked about, and you feel like, I paid more than I've ever paid for a tank full of gas. And I paid more for the coffee than I've ever paid. And I got a horrible meal. You're not going back. Like, on a very human level, the understanding of why the business works, it's very straightforward, right? We make it more complicated because it's a conglomerate. It's a multinational corporation. They have 50,000 employees. They have 3 different brands. But at the end of the day, how do I know that the customer will show up tomorrow? You brought up something fascinating, and I was looking actually at hotel chains. I'm not going to mention any, but I saw a fascinating, and we were talking about the evolution of us as investors, but also the evolution of businesses. So let's say you and I researched hotels 20 years ago when I started in this business. Hotels had assets. They were asset heavy. I'm talking about the publicly traded universe. And it was a very different model. Then there was this shift about 10 years ago when the assets were separated from the operating business. And I feel like there's another shift happening, which I find curious. I'm not endorsing any idea, just as an observer of the evolution of the business. Exactly what you said is happening. A lot of those chains these days have a very high percent of revenue coming from repeat customers that are using their apps and they're part of the loyalty program, which blew my mind because I realized there's yet another change happening. People want to go and stay with the brands that they trust. There was loyalty that was developed that was not observed to that level before. And I don't know if it's the apps, it's the points, it's the experience, but all of it together invites the customer again, which goes back to what I started with. How do I know that your customer will show up tomorrow? If you're running a gas station, I want to buy your gas station. How do I know that the next day when you leave, when I own your gas station, somebody will show up, right? These are the things I'm looking at. And it's the same things I'm looking at when I'm buying shares of a $100 billion company. How do I know that people will show up and pay for the services and goods that you provide?
Sat down in Omaha and I brought my water out to have a little drink while sitting waiting for Warren to come out. And the guy sitting next to me is like, oh, you're a Hilton Honors guy. Mm-hmm. It's a Hilton water, right? Turns out he's a hotel developer. And he's like, hey, you could divide now people into Marriott versus Hilton. Uh-huh. And he's like, I've already pegged you as a Hilton guy. And I was just laughing, right? Like, this makes sense. A very important concept you brought up, the idea of value and value propositions. And especially when you can articulate what a company's doing, what they're doing well. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, one individual can kind of be a company. What's their values, what's their ethical system, and what's their future cash flow, probabilistically thinking. In fact, Warren gave an awesome talk once, I don't know if you've seen this talk, to MBA students. And he's like, hey, you're going to own 10% of somebody in this room. Who would you choose? And first thing he joked is, don't pick a trust fund, recipient. The second thing he said was, I want to know the qualities of the individual. And it was fascinating because quite quickly these students, rightfully so, are talking about stuff like hardworking, ethical, honest, smart. But even they got some good concepts going where it was stuff like leverage. And I'm not talking debt leverage, leveraging others, being a leader, people want to follow. And then it's bringing up another concept of values. When they asked Charlie, how do you pick, he has a long history of picking very competent management. How do you pick people? And he's like, oh, well, I come in for an interview. I sit and I chat with them. And when they leave, he goes to the receptionist and says, how were you treated? He knows more from that than he does from what they're saying, which I find to be a fascinating lens into correct way of thinking.
I've heard other people mention that as well, that they bring a potential business partner or somebody they want to invest in and just they see how they treat other people. And if they treat them with respect, it's a whole different experience. And if it's the opposite, you feel like if you're not in the room, going back to what we talked about, whoever you're interacting with might not treat people the way you would like them to treat others. And I think there's the more I think about it, investing is a numbers game. It's a very intellectual. It's very scientific at times. It's very technical. There's a whole vocabulary that I think maybe scares or alienates people. But at the end of the day, it's that very human experience of trust on both sides. The clients trust you with their capital, and you trust business operators with the capital that's entrusted to you. And it really matters. It's a people's business on both sides. It really matters who you're dealing with on both ends. And I think the way I look at it, as a species, the language is 50,000 years old. And I feel like we've been communicating, and I know that, we all know that, long before the language was invented. I've been in meetings where the language side, somebody explained something to me, looked beautiful. And I know that you like fraud, so you will like this and have some thoughts about it. But I felt very uncomfortable with this conversation. And I said in some meetings with different managements of companies, I used to go to a lot of those, much less these days. And I would walk out from the meeting, and the best I could describe to my colleagues is that I wouldn't leave my wallet with the people I just met. And they would say, why? Because the balance sheet looks great, and the financials are great, and it looks like they're doing. I just didn't feel comfortable. And I trust that intuition. We're talking about, Berkshire or Markel or other businesses, long-term shareholders. They trusted that kind of intuition, that this is the right person or not. And I've been trusting that much more in the second half of my career than before. I guess that allowed me not to get fooled. You talked about failure, but in investing, it's not just the upside, but also the mistakes. And I'm sure you all agree, right? Mm-hmm. So I always feel, yes, there will be things I can find, and you have your accounting mindset, so you can sift through numbers and you can find things. But on a human level, there's something that just doesn't add up, and you don't have to know exactly why. You can walk out. The one specific meeting that I brought up, and I'm not going to say which company, but 2 years later, there were headlines, and the CEO was fired, and the statements, they had to restate their financials. It wasn't, I don't think there was any criminal action against them, but there were certain practices that were, a little bit too aggressive, you could say, and I'm being polite here, that, fooled shareholders and everybody participating. And all I had to know in that moment is that it just doesn't add up. And when you ask about the source of that intuition, because I've been thinking about it a lot, I think we're born with some of it on a human level. Can I trust somebody or not? But by being in a certain field, I think you acquire more and more of that invisible, almost subconscious understanding if you can trust or not. And I don't know how to precisely, frame it, but I think a lot of people I interact with, they just get it. And I'm curious how you think about it. There are moments where you feel like, I wouldn't leave my wallet with these guys, and I don't have to be invested in your company. Have a good day.
You go to a function, you meet a bunch of individuals, and the conversation quite quickly turns into, what categories am I putting this individual in?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, professional, okay, they're a lawyer, they're an investor, and you're profiling. Right. One of the fun games I like to play is, would I trust this individual to be an executor of my estate?
That's a big hurdle.
Kids, right? You want a trustworthy individual who's going to take over your affairs. And it's interesting if you play that game as a way of categorizing individuals, because something inherent just starts bubbling up, like, this person would claw their way to the top and do whatever it takes to get to the top. And that includes potentially ethical compromise. You meet some individuals that won't even be, it's not in their ethos. It's not in their nature to act that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a fun thing to do. And I think it's a wise thing on an investment standpoint. In other words, you meet and they're hyper aggressive using sales techniques. You could tell that they're more a sales individual than they are a, let's call it a founder who's passionate about the business. It's a very different meeting when that occurs. I have some people in my family that are physicians as well. And one family member who's a physician told me, they meet thousands of patients a year.
Right.
And he's like, the stories that I could write about what my patients have taught me could fill volumes.
Mm.
And I thought, well, this is a fascinating concept. And being an auditor and walking into numerous businesses over the years, I've seen good and bad. You, I guarantee, over your long career, has seen very interesting clients with very interesting stories. So I'm a story guy. I love stories. I love reading business stories. My question to you, and can you make it anonymous? Because I know you're going to, and protect the confidentiality of your clients. But could you share a story or a lesson learned from a client, while protecting their identity?
I mean, so many, and I'm just fascinated with people and people's stories. And when I onboard a new client, I spend a lot of time getting to know them. I recently had Dan Solon on the show, who is a retired lawyer who was an investment advisor, and he wrote a book, Ask How to Relate to People. And he has this idea of, basically asking questions and follow-up questions, trying to understand who you're talking to and be more interested than interesting as a formula for the right conversation. When I meet new people, whether it's, colleagues, friends, people that are listening to the podcast, people that read anything that I wrote, or potential clients, I'm just curious about them. And I just want to know, tell me, how did you get to where you are? And through this experience and opening up this door, and listeners know that they can reach out, and I read all the emails. With some of them, I get to find some time to talk to. They tell me stories of their families and family wealth and all kinds of stories that fit into what I'm, talking about on this podcast. But you get to learn a lot about the aspect of the investment profession that I'm fascinated with, which is that the capital, the financial capital, doesn't exist in a void. It means something to people. It was given in a certain way. I like this idea of giving with warm hands, which is a very powerful image to me. You could give me a very small amount, but if you give it with your warm hands, it has a very different power than if you give me 1,000 times more, but in a way that I'll feel that maybe you regret it. Maybe you're compensating for the fact that you never told me that you love me, right? There's a whole emotional message around the capital. So when people say, I have $10 million to invest, I think a lot of people would say, well, it's just a number. Let's double it over, 5, 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years. I look at it and tell me more. How did this amount come about? And there's always a story. A grandpa traveled across the continent or across the ocean. He had this idea that grew to a bigger idea. He partnered with somebody. It became something they could distribute across the state or a province or the country. And then they ended up selling it to a bigger competitor. And here we are. I got 1/5 of what the other siblings got. Everybody got 1/5. And here I have 10 million. And I know already more. And then tell me more how this money actually entered your life. I find it fascinating, right? So I get to understand a bit more what this money means to you. And you feel like, why does it really matter? I think every single decision that follows will be linked to that kind of flow of how this money came about. If you feel like you shouldn't have that money, subconsciously you'll start to make decisions to get rid of that money. And I've seen it, I've witnessed it. And you might argue that, no, I want this money to stick around, but watching the actions, the actual decisions will make it more and more obvious that for some reason, Jeff, you're trying to get rid of that 10 million. Right? And I'll ask questions to figure out why. Or it could be the opposite, the lighter way, the more positive way, that you feel like, I know I deserve the 10 million. On top of it, I respect where it came from. I know what my dad or my grandpa or my grandma had to do for this money to be around for us to talk about. I say that family fortune is a miracle because it really is a miracle. And that it's here, that it grew. If it lasted multiple generations, it outlasted the forces of nature, the wisdom of the Proverbs and human nature, you name it. But it's here. Let's talk about it. And then if you have some light, positive, cheerful way of looking at it, that it can serve you, it can serve the next generation. I think some fun things can happen with it, and we can do something really useful, productive in a constructive way. And that's when I get really excited and I can really help. And what can we do to make this money? Can it be deployed in a certain productive way in a collection of businesses and then serve you and your kids? And then I hear stories of what this money meant to people and how it changed how they live their life. And Jeff, it's not that they have to go around and spend what they have or what that amount grew to, but the fact that that amount is present in their life. You were talking about estate planning and so on, and I've interacted with families that transition from a generation to generation. It's the nature of the business, and you can see the freedom, the lightness, the quality of sleep that amount can provide. So they can, for example, leave the job they don't like anymore. They can say no to a boss that's not pleasant. They can say yes to a project they've been excited about. Yes, they can accept a job that's not as financially rewarding because there is some payout coming out from the family fortune, family pool, family trust. And I see how it brings, this lightness and this unrushed kind of wealth can really help families. So these are the stories that I get to see, and I've seen a range of those, from the ones where I feel like I think there's a better way to go about it, to the other ones where I feel like a lot of other people should know that there is this way to go about it that's so much more, positive and helpful and engaging and rewarding for all the participants. I like this idea that, we talk about money, capital, currency. We use many different terms, but even the smallest amount has an impact. And I jokingly mentioned this story to somebody, how if you find a penny on the street after this conversation later this afternoon, that penny financially means nothing, right? But you will feel like, hey, I'm lucky. I'm going to smile more. Maybe I'm going to, say yes to whatever thing was, happening the second half of the day. That little penny has a huge impact on you right away, emotionally speaking. And you can imagine what a larger amount, a life-changing amount, what kind of an impact it can have on how you feel about the world, about the options that you have. And I have this aspiration that no family should start with zero all over again. And I talk about it now and then, how when you think about knowledge, you and I are very curious minds. We build on, we sit on the shoulders of the giants that came before us, the imminent dead, as Charlie would call them. So we don't start with every generation with no knowledge, understanding, or with zero. We were building on something else, on Newton and Einstein and everybody else in every field. Even in the investment profession, we're building on what Charlie did and what Buffett is doing and so on. But when it comes to actual financial capital, so many families technically start with zero. We're not talking about large inheritance, we're talking about zero. And I'm wondering, what can we do? And I asked the question, as we spoke before, what can we do so that more families have something to pass on? People talk about this massive transfer between generations happening in the next few decades, but it's still very concentrated. What can we do so that each family has something to pass on? And sometimes $10,000 is life-changing for the next generation, right? They can take a gap year and not go to the school they don't want to go to. Think about it, and then go the next year and pursue the career they really want. That 10,000 could be life-changing as much as 1 million or 10 million or 1 billion.
Every once in a while I do deep dives into weird things. So last month,
Let's go there.
I go on YouTube and I'm just searching. And I love the algorithm, by the way, because it knows me. And it's like, hey, do you want to watch a documentary about sushi and the history of sushi? I'm like, yes, I do. Bring it. And,
You got me.
right, exactly. And so I'm watching Bureau Dreams of Sushi. I don't know if you've seen this documentary.
No.
The guy's in his 90s, and he dreams of sushi. And he created unbelievably high quality. For a time, it had 3 Michelin star, blah, 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 like to the stars famous type stuff. And he talked about like the craftsman model and the apprentice. And we're talking about years and years for the poor guy who had to make the egg and was rejected for year after year. So then I watched another one on Japanese sword making. And like it is multiple years to be an apprentice, and the forging of the steel and the heat and with the cooling process and how the steel is rid of impurities and even the edge, like the amount of work and effort. Then I contrasted that to my social experiment, which I like to run from time to time. So I bought $100 worth of crypto. I did that on an app. When I bought my $100 worth of crypto, confetti came down. Congratulations, it says. You're an investor, it said. Then it started sending me emails, right? How to trade quickly, right? How to be a day trader in the crypto world. And it starts talking about all these new cryptos that are coming. And, do you want to be part of this IPO process? And I'm like, this is literally the opposite of that 10 years to learn to make the egg model. And you came to my mind because in our walks in Switzerland, I think you have a behavioral edge that's more in line with that craftsman model. And that is patience. It's the opposite of, and I don't want to name the app that I used to buy the thing, but it took literally 2 minutes for me to buy, right? It was so quick. And you're a trader, which is the opposite of an apprentice, a slow building. In our last conversation, you explained you feel like you're a chef and you want to make your own food now. You started your own firm. And so I see this apprentice model and this patient model, behavioral edge that I think you have coming to fruition. So I don't know if there's a question embedded in that. It's more of a commentary on where I see you.
I love how you crafted it, this idea of a lifelong pursuit of something that you're passionate about. And so many thoughts come to mind. So I'm going to start somewhere in the middle, but I was thinking about how if you find something, and I don't know if the word obsession is the best word to describe it, but you find something that you think about falling asleep and you think about going to bed. And that's something that I experience when I think of broadly defined investing. But when I say investing, could be a book about human psychology to understand why we commit certain mistakes. It could be another book about the evolution to understand actually how the evolution in nature and evolution in businesses rhyme, right? So it could be a whole variety of books. But I have this passion and obsession with investing framed in a certain way as, on one hand, ownership of businesses. On the other hand, it serves a certain purpose, which is to grow and in a way perpetuate family fortunes that have truly, I call it infinite. That's why I call the firm Blue Infinitas Capital, because I see it as an infinite investment horizon. So the obsession is the element. The second thing that I'm exploring and I find fascinating is I don't do it for the money. And when I picked up One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch 20-some years ago, 25 years ago by now, and I told this story before on this podcast and I gave a TED Talk about it, how I saw this book not as a message that here I'm going to beat the market and I'm going to become the richest person in the world. No, I thought of it as this is a fascinating intellectual pursuit for me because I can spend time to figure out how particular businesses work. And if I'm more right than I'm wrong, and if I'm pretty, disciplined and patient about it, this could work in my favor. Will I triple my money or quintuple my money? I don't know, but I feel like directionally I'm onto something, right? And I had Jim O'Shaughnessy on the show, and he said to find something that you would pay to do. He said something about going to stores that you would pay to shop at. And Jim brought up this idea, and Jim is a Wall Street veteran and wrote What Works on Wall Street back in the day. Fascinating individual, a brilliant mind. And he said, think of something that you would pay to do. And he's doing O'Shaughnessy Ventures these days and funding a lot of different projects. So he says, I'm basically paying to do what I love to do. So, but if you find something that you would do, even if the money was not part of the equation, that's something really special. And to me, investing is a particular pursuit on so many levels. But one of the dimensions I'm fascinated with is that if you are a brain surgeon, you would never want to be your own patient. You actually cannot ever be your own patient. Would you agree?
Correct.
It would be very hard. But
Same with it on a family member, right? It just doesn't work.
exactly. But with the investment profession, you could actually become your own client. And I know investors who say that they are their own best clients. And I think there might be some truth to it because you are in your own head, right? Your client is not. So you have to explain to your client why certain actions are taken. You have to communicate. I think communication is one of those intangible and not discussed enough kind of skills and talents, or something that you have to develop when you're an investor. But you can become your own client. So at some point, and I love the fact that it's so aligned, that if the idea is good for me, an investment idea is good for the clients, and it's in an ideal world good for all the clients, right? There's this beautiful alignment that I don't have to be selling something to somebody that I wouldn't buy. No, if this is a good idea for me, it's good for the client. If it's good for the client, of course it's good for me. I love that it's so straightforward. But what I'm saying here is that if you're successful at what you do, however you define it, it doesn't have to be beating the market or reaching this hurdle, whatever way you want to look at it, and you're growing, you're compounding your capital, you become your own client with your own money. Eventually, you don't really have to do it for the money. And when you really think about it, that's the beauty of it. And anybody that comes to any profession with the assumption that they will do it just for the money, these are not the people that will stay for a long period of time. And as a patient, would you like to go to a knee surgeon that's just doing it for the money, and the minute you walk in, they just see the dollar signs and they don't even care what your name is? Of course not, right? And the investment profession, you would like somebody that is so passionate about it that they would do it even if that particular service is provided almost for free or for free. You provide so much value. And I'm going to add last...
Students. And my advice is very, very similar to them. In terms of what's something, you win the lottery, money is no longer a factor. What would you want to dedicate your life to?
I love that question. I love that question. You go so much deeper about talking about what you actually want to do. And I can't see myself stopping the investment pursuit, as in research, search, asking questions, exploring, having conversations like these. It doesn't feel like work. That's how I look at it. And when a client comes to me with a complicated question, and I don't know if this question will take an hour or 5 hours or 2 weeks, right? And if you say, well, is it billable? I don't know if it's billable. I don't care. I have a problem that I'm fascinated with, and I'd love to help. It's like my dad pulling over on the side of the road. He sees that he's needed, and he has to walk over and help as much as he can before the ambulance arrives. So this is the kind of thing that you're looking for, that I'm looking for in other people as well. And the last thing I'm going to say is that you care. And it's very important to me, and I mention it quite a lot, that it's as simple but as profound to me that you actually care. And on a human level, we go see any service provider. Let's talk about doctors again. But if you know that they actually care, there's something special that happens. And if they don't care, no matter if they're competent, if all the other things line up, if they don't care, I want to leave the room, right? So if you find somebody that's obsessed, is not doing it for the money, and they actually care, you should treasure individuals like these, whether they're your accountants or your doctors or your dentists or your lawyers or your investment advisors. The more people like that you can have in your life, I think the luckier you are.
Charlie invested his funds with other people's, including a fund, which, if you think about it, is almost absurd.
Yeah.
Here's one of the most brilliant minds that existed in the last 100 years, and he's giving other people his money. And I think that's a worthy concept to spend some time thinking about. Why would Charlie choose to give his money to Li Lu or to Ashton Properties when he is so competent and capable to invest his own money himself? There's another concept that comes to mind, which is I have some family members, I don't have a fund, but I have some family members that I invest for them. Historically, that has outperformed my own. And I think that's worthy of reflection as to why. And my risk tolerance for my own money is different than when I have external funds coming in. And it's like, I take it to a different level. I'm more conservative. I have a greater degree of conviction before I invest those funds. And that's actually outperformed, which I think is a fascinating question. Okay, one last question, because I might be going over time, but I'm enjoying the conversation.
Let's do it.
In your book, Outsmarting the Crowd, you highlighted a hero of mine, Benjamin Franklin, and you talked about we stand on the shoulders of great individuals, and Benjamin Graham, of course, being one of them. But if you go back further, there's individuals like Franklin with a whackload of lessons learned. So you chose to mention him in the book. My question to you is, what were the key concepts? Why was Benjamin mentioned in your book? What did you pull from his life? What was the lessons learned from him that should and ought to be shared?
It's fascinating that he is he the only individual on U.S. money that's not a president? I think I'm right about that. Am I not?
I believe so.
I think I'm right about that. He was just a one-of-a-kind person, and the more you study his life, the more fascinating it is. And he would find, just as Charlie did, and then Charlie obviously got influenced by him, certain principles that would make sense. And I'll bring up a story or two that really resonated with me. Back in the day, books were expensive, so you would lend and borrow books if you wanted to read books. And he would use this as an excuse, the story goes, to connect with people. And he would offer some books to them and then borrow some books from them. And I found it fascinating because to me, this podcast, it's an exchange of ideas. I'm kind of like handing in something and then getting something back, and then it multiplies and the audience is benefiting from it as we go. But I have this idea, and I think I'm trying to channel Franklin in a way that when I have a guest, and I was recording with somebody this week, I'll bring it up. I talked to Derek Sivers, who wrote a couple of books, and he's a bit of a legend on the music front and the internet, company creation, CD Baby, and these days he writes fascinating books. And we were talking about something, and I felt like I want to leave him with something that maybe he hasn't thought about. And there were a couple of things that I think he appreciated, but one of them was we were talking about his last book, which is Useful, Not True. And I brought up Chris Mayer, who was a guest on my podcast a couple of times. Chris is coming back, and he wrote obviously the book about the 100x, 100 beggars, but he also wrote a wonderful book that got some rewards about general semantics and the nuanced way of understanding the language. One of the ideas is the English language without the absolutes, how much we use never, no one, everybody, everyone. And he suggests, based on the school of thought of general semantics, to maybe go easy on those. Because I think the way we say a value investor would never buy the stock. You and I have heard that phrase, right? Or a growth investor would never buy that stock. We limit ourselves. But anyways, I brought it up because his book, Useful Not True, goes to the depths of what's true, what's really, really true. And we realize that even time, he brings it up in the conversation, there are time zones. And you asked me actually about the time zone for this call, and I forgot that you're central. And for me, it's 11. For you, it's 10, right? So we can't even agree on that. So he talks about the idea that there are certain things in life that are useful, but they're not absolutely true, and place it to a whole new, level of, intellectual exploration. But the point I'm trying to make is that Derek has read everything that's out there. He actually lists on his website all the books he has read. I highly recommend his website and as a resource. But he has not heard of Chris Mayer's General Semantics. So I felt like, just as Franklin would trade a book, I traded an idea and made a small connection. Listen, there's somebody I know of that talked about something that I find fascinating. And I left Derek with a new idea. And on some level, it put a smile on my face. So I pulled a little Franklin over there, trading an idea for an idea. But not as an exchange, but more as like, I'd love to leave you with something more than you showed up with. What can I do? And it's the value proposition or the value creation or the value. How can I be more of value? Charlie at the end said, be useful. That's what he always wanted to do. And I think that's the essence of what I'm trying to do, even with this podcast. I'd like to be useful. How can I be useful? And I can't predict in what ways and in what exchanges and ideas. But in some way, I'd like to think that each episode and each conversation, somebody out there finds useful. And maybe it will put a smile on their face, and maybe they will make a more educated decision about something important in their life. Or maybe they'll share a story with me.
Some people are unlikely to change. And Benjamin Franklin would, I think, have disagreed with that. Because your book concept that you brought up, I remember reading, he had enemies. And he would go there and pick a book from their bookshelf and say, "Can I borrow it?" And he would return it in mint condition. And he would compliment the owner of the book. "You have amazing taste. You're so bright. Your library is amazing." And then he would ask eventually for another book. So first of all, this starts creating reciprocity. Then it starts creating liking. Then it also creates, this is an individual who likes to give and likes to share. So he's changing the person from the inward out by those. In other words, he's a precursor to Cialdini's influence, the psychology of persuasion.
And I would say an enlightened being. You know, he saw things the way very few people saw at the time. And we have those individuals, and Charlie, to me, was one of them, that they saw things that many of us are not seeing. And I love going to Omaha, and Charlie is obviously no longer there, to be reminded of those ideas and principles. And I had William Green on the show that we both know, Richer, Wiser, Happier, and he told me something that really struck a chord with me, that you could go about your day and see everything as a miracle, or nothing as a miracle, basically the opposite. And I kind of like what William says, that I'd like to see everything as a miracle. Isn't it nicer? And Derek Sivers, I shared it with him, he said, "But you know it's not true." And I said, "It doesn't matter." And I played on the title of his book. I said, "It's useful to me. It's useful to me to believe that everybody is kind somewhere deep inside. And it's useful to me to believe that everything that happens is a miracle, a small one, a big one. A family fortune could be a huge miracle. But somebody saving a seat for you in Omaha, which is something I did for one of the people I was standing in line with, you know, it costs you nothing. But I made somebody's day, and he wrote me a beautiful email after that saying I was very grateful I had a place to sit so close, and I could enjoy the experience so much more. I just see miracles wherever I look. So whatever Derek tells me that it's not true, I'll tell him it's useful.
I have just because you brought it up, Richer, Wiser, Happier is probably in the top 3 books that I've read in the last years. That's a constant recommendation from me. And I love that it's not a how to get rich book at all. The amount of insights, like I was exhausted reading that book on William's behalf, because it just is like 30, 40 years of seeking and questioning and getting evidence to condense it. But the story will go full circle for a moment. I was we rented a house, and I'm at a beach with my kids. And I'm like, I'm going to walk against the water. I'm going to do resistance training as a form of exercise. And I'm the only one doing this at the beach. And my teenage daughter's like, "Oh, Dad," right? And so there I am doing resistance training, going up and down. Of course, why am I doing that? I read Richer, Happier, Wiser, and William Green explains what Sir John Templeton did. In the ocean, his form of exercise, resistance training. So the concept of shameless cloning comes up, of course, and learning. And this has nothing to do with investing. Like this, what is this? This is, an experiment on health, right? Does this work? How does it feel? Is it good cardio? Whatever, fine. So I'm doing this. Fast forward, I had William Green and a Templeton family member in front of me. And I'm like, the connection's here. I got to share the story. And so they get to think of their loved one, the Templeton, who's passed away. And William Green gets to hear a compliment on the influence that his book and his teachings has, which, I don't know, to me, it feels great. It's rewarding.
It's a fascinating book, and William is a wonderful human being. And I think you're bringing up Lauren Templeton. And I had Lauren on the show, and I think she's a fascinating investor and an individual, and we've had some fun conversations. And she shared some of the stories of Sir John back in the day. And I'll just bring up one since you brought up the topic, and we talked about patience and discipline. And I feel like some of it can be learned, and some of it you can create for yourself. And when Sir John moved to the Bahamas from New York back in the day, decades ago, I don't know, half a century ago now probably. And he would get the Wall Street Journal with a few-day delay. And to make a trade, he had to go, and Lauren told me, stand at a phone booth and throw coins, put coins in to call his broker in New York. He basically had almost physical obstacles to react to the headlines and to the noise. And then if he had an impulse to sell, he had to go through so many hoops to make the trade, much more complicated than the trade you conducted with your confetti flying, right? So when I feel like we all have weaknesses, but if you know what your weakness is, find a way to manage it. And I think there's some hope in there that not all of us are born very disciplined and patient. We can develop it. And even if you find that you react to certain things in a certain way, or you're not happy with your certain aspect of your, personality or your makeup, you can find ways to make some things easier for you if you want more of it, and harder for you if you don't want them, right? Speaking of resistance, but I found it fascinating. One last thought about richer, wiser, happier. To me, it's the building blocks. The investment profession, it's a lab, like the market in investing. For me, it's a laboratory where you can go and test your ideas. And that's what I saw when I picked up One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch. I thought, it doesn't matter if I'm young, if I'm old, where I was born, who I am, if I have a short name or a long name. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. All that matters is my intellectual, my mental ability to investigate, be curious, find things, analyze things, and then have the market be the place where I can practice it. And if you want to be a day trader, you're playing in a different game. If you want to own businesses for decades, you're in a different game. You choose the game that you want to be a part of. And once you start doing it, you realize, and I think that's what Charlie realized, that through that practice, you build those mental models. And those mental models apply not just in investing, but maybe in family life, maybe how you treat friends, playing the infinite game of friendship, right? You're not winning or losing. In friendship, you're trying to make it last. So you're treating your friend better, the way you would treat, a customer better, a client better. You start to apply the same models across the board. And you talked about, resistance and working out and staying healthy. And eventually, when I was reading this book, I was thinking of William and his voice, how happiness sneaks up on you, right? It can be a direct. We all know that you can't approach happiness, I don't believe, in a direct way. There's a term called obliquity, where you reach something in an indirect way. And I feel like happiness is something that sneaks up on you. So you figured out one piece, you figured out the second piece, and then you realize, Jeff, I'm having a good day. I'm really happy. And that's what happened to me reading this book, when I realized really smart people tried to solve one subset of problems and found some solutions, and then applied what they've been learning in terms of mental models across the board. And by accident or not, intentionally or not, they found peace or freedom or happiness or contentment, however you want to describe it, maybe all of them at the same time. That's what's beautiful about that book, and I highly recommend that book. And I feel like having William's voice in your head is something special.
My comment to that would be similar to Charlie. Nothing to add. Completely agree. Actually, another book recommendation. Sorry, there's something to add. Because the philosophical lens of, it's not, you're wise to put caveats in the word. It's not necessarily happiness. Like, you feel happy, those are just a moment. It's right. More the goal is contentment. And Soul in the Game by Vitali. It's a book that marries philosophical lenses with investing, with life, and does it brilliantly.
Soul in the Game, Vitali Katznelson, our mutual friend. Yes, that's a wonderful book. And it's the essence of what we were talking about as well. When you find somebody that has their soul in the game, whether it's an investor or a doctor or an accountant or a lawyer, and you know that everything is on the line for them, this is something that they have to do. That's somebody really special. When I look at my parents, they had to be doctors, and I wanted to find something in my life that I just had to do. And I feel like very, very blessed and very, very fortunate to be serving the families I work with, investing in businesses that I admire, and seeing this beautiful flow and how this can add value to everybody involved. And borrowing from Jim O'Shaughnessy, I would pay to do it, but nobody has to know that.
Not a bad life. So I got through half my questions, but I say that this is a great point.
Yes.
Bogumil, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Jeff, this was a blast, and I really appreciate and taking the time, the effort, and giving so much thought to prepare those questions and take us on this wonderful journey. And I'm sure we'll pick it up where we left it off, because there's so much more to explore. But thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.